In April of 1961, a Soviet cosmonaut circled the planet and came home a legend. America had nothing to answer with. No orbital flight, no proven hardware, barely a single suborbital hop to its name. And yet, within weeks, the United States stood before the world and made an almost reckless promise. A man on the moon and safely home again before the decade closed. It sounded less like a plan and more like a dare aimed at physics itself. Because here is what rarely gets said. The technology to make that promise real did not exist yet. Not the navigation, not the life support, not the ability to keep two spacecraft from colliding at 17,000 miles an hour. Something had to fill that gap. A program built to fail fast, learn faster, and quietly solve the handful of problems standing between a nation and the lunar surface. History remembers the leap. It forgets the bridge. That bridge was Gemini. The program history skipped over. We choose to go to the moon in this decade, President Kennedy declared, and do the other things. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard. It was a magnificent line. It was also, quietly, a massive gamble. Because at the time Kennedy said it, America's entire human spaceflight resume consisted of one man, one flight, and 15 minutes above the atmosphere. Alan Shepard hadn't even orbited the Earth. He'd simply gone up and come back down. The Soviets, meanwhile, had already put a man in full orbit. The gap between the two space powers wasn't close. It was embarrassing. So NASA found itself in an impossible position. Promised the moon to the entire world, while still trying to figure out how to keep a single astronaut alive for more than a quarter of an hour. The agency needed a proving ground, somewhere to learn how to survive in space for days rather than minutes, how to guide one spacecraft into a rendezvous with another, how to step outside a capsule and still make it home alive, and how to bring a crew back through the atmosphere with pinpoint accuracy rather than blind luck. That proving ground was Project Gemini, 10 missions, 16 astronauts, and 20 months that quietly rewrote what NASA thought was possible. This is Nebulix, and today we're uncovering the program most people forget, the one that made the moon landing survivable. Before Gemini could solve any problems in orbit, it first had to solve one on the launch pad, because the rocket meant to carry it there was, quite literally, built to deliver a warhead, not a human being. The Gemini Titan II descended directly from an intercontinental ballistic missile. Compared to the smaller, more forgiving Mercury Atlas rocket, the Titan II was larger, stiffer, and packed with dense, fast-igniting fuels designed for one purpose: getting a nuclear payload airborne as quickly as possible. Comfort and stability for a crew were never part of the original design brief. That mismatch showed up almost immediately as a phenomenon engineers came to call Pogo oscillation. As the rocket climbed, tiny natural vibrations in its frame caused the fuel lines to flex. That flex altered fuel pressure, which pushed a small surge of extra propellant into the engine. The engine responded with a burst of extra thrust, a physical kick that rattled back up through the rocket's structure, flexing the fuel lines even harder. The cycle fed itself, faster and faster, turning the entire vehicle into something closer to a giant, uncontrolled pogo stick. On early unmanned test flights, the shaking grew so violent it would have knocked a conscious astronaut out cold. NASA drew a hard line. No crew would fly until the vibrations dropped below a strict safety threshold. With no time to design an entirely new rocket, NASA assembled a task force of over 1,000 engineers to fix the one they already had. Their solution was elegant. Small chambers of compressible gas inserted directly into the fuel lines, acting as shock absorbers. When a pressure pulse surged toward the engine, it hit the gas pocket first, compressing it like a spring and smoothing the flow before it ever reached ignition. The fix worked. Astronauts rode the Titan II throughout the entire Gemini program without incident. The payoff extended far beyond Gemini itself. Years later, when NASA's massive Saturn V began shaking during an unmanned Apollo test flight, engineers weren't starting from zero. They already had the mathematical models and the physical solutions sitting on the shelf, borrowed straight from a problem Gemini had already solved, the rendezvous problem. Getting off the ground was one challenge. Finding another spacecraft in the vastness of orbit and closing the distance without colliding was an entirely different order of problem, and one nobody had ever actually attempted. The stakes were high because of a decision made back on the ground. NASA had settled on a lunar landing method that required two separate spacecraft, a command module to travel to the moon and a lunar module to descend to its surface. That meant astronauts would eventually need to separate from one craft, operate independently, and then find and reconnect with it, all while moving at roughly 17,000 miles per hour. Before Gemini, NASA had never flown two crewed vehicles at once, let alone joined them together in space. The first real test paired two spacecraft directly, one serving as a stationary target, the other tasked with tracking it down. But simply flying past wasn't good enough. The goal was station keeping, matching another vehicle's speed and altitude so precisely that both craft appeared frozen in place relative to each other, despite hurtling around the planet at orbital velocity. Solving this required rewriting the intuitive rules of driving and applying the strange logic of orbital mechanics instead. To catch a spacecraft ahead of you, a pilot often had to fire thrusters backward, not forward. That drop pushed the craft into a lower orbit, where gravity is stronger and speed increases, allowing it to close the gap before rising back up to intercept at exactly the right moment. It was the opposite of every driving instinct a person had ever developed. Alongside the math, engineers built the hardware to execute it, an onboard digital computer linked to radar that measured both distance and closing speed, translating raw signals into steering commands a pilot could actually use. In December of 1965, the theory met reality. From over 400 kilometers out, the tracking computer began crunching numbers for the approach. As the gap closed to 80 kilometers, the pursuit became visual. One astronaut spotted what looked like an unfamiliar star, which turned out to be sunlight glinting off the target spacecraft ahead. The final approach didn't go entirely to plan. In the last 30 meters, the changing orbital geometry outpaced what onboard computers of the era could track, forcing the pilot to take manual control, easing the craft forward by eye until the two vehicles held position just inches apart for nearly 5 hours, circling the Earth in perfect formation. It proved something no one had been certain of, that two spacecraft could find each other in the emptiness of orbit and simply stop. Finding another spacecraft was one milestone. Physically joining with it was another entirely. And the mission tasked with proving it nearly ended in disaster, with a name most people would later recognize at the controls. This time, the target wasn't a crewed vehicle keeping formation. It was an unmanned robotic stage, meaning the approaching spacecraft had to do 100% of the work alone. At the controls sat a pilot who would, 4 years later, become the most famous astronaut in history, Neil Armstrong, alongside co-pilot David Scott. Using the same rendezvous techniques proven in earlier missions, Armstrong guided his craft toward the target at a crawl, under 1 mile per hour, knowing that even a slight misalignment on contact could send both vehicles spinning out of control. Switching to manual optical, aiming for the final approach, he balanced 6 directions of motion simultaneously, nudging thrusters with the kind of precision that left no room for error. Minutes later, the docking mechanism locked into place. Success. Then, everything went wrong. During a routine maneuver shortly after docking, the combined spacecraft began to roll unexpectedly. Armstrong fired thrusters to correct it, but the spin didn't stop. It got worse, and at that exact moment, the crew passed out of radio contact with mission control, cut off on the far side of the planet with no one to consult and no time to spare. Suspecting the problem originated in the target vehicle, Armstrong made the call to undock. It was the wrong instinct at the wrong moment. Without the added mass of the second craft, his own spacecraft began spinning even faster, eventually reaching a full rotation per second. The astronauts felt blood being forced toward their heads. They were seconds from losing consciousness entirely. The actual cause turned out to be a stuck thruster on their own vehicle, firing continuously and undetected. Armstrong shut down the malfunctioning system and reached for the only backup available, the re-entry control thrusters, normally reserved for the trip home. Burning through the vast majority of that fuel, he finally brought the spin under control. With so little propellant left, there was only one option remaining, an immediate, unplanned return to Earth. Hours later, both astronauts splashed down safely in the Pacific. They hadn't just survived. They'd proven docking was possible. And paid for that proof with one of the closest calls in the history of American spaceflight. The brutal truth about spacewalking. Docking, one spacecraft to another, was a mechanical problem. Stepping outside a spacecraft entirely, into the vacuum of space with nothing but a suit standing between a person and instant death, was something else altogether. And nobody was entirely sure the human body could handle it. The first American to try it was tasked with something almost unthinkable, given how young the space program still was. Barely 4 years after the U.S. had struggled to keep one man alive in space for 15 minutes, NASA was now preparing to open a hatch and let an astronaut float freely outside it. The suit built for the occasion had been finalized barely a year earlier. When the moment came, it worked. Remarkably well, in fact. The astronaut appeared to glide effortlessly, using a small handheld thruster to push himself around by firing bursts of gas. It looked almost peaceful. That ease didn't last. The handheld thruster ran dry within minutes, leaving the astronaut with no way to control his movement. Without handholds, small motions sent him tumbling in unpredictable directions, and what had looked graceful moments earlier became a fight simply to stay oriented. The real crisis came at the end, not the middle. When it was time to climb back inside, the hatch refused to lock. A mechanical spring inside the mechanism wouldn't compress, and without a sealed hatch, the cabin couldn't be repressurized, a problem that threatened to leave both astronauts stranded with a slowly dwindling supply of oxygen. The two men wrestled with the mechanism by brute force, jamming fingers into gaps and forcing gears together by hand, until it finally clicked shut. Both were drenched in sweat, hearts pounding by the time it was over. NASA logged it as a success. Behind the scenes, it was a warning. Working in zero gravity was far more physically demanding than anyone had predicted. That warning went unheeded, just long enough to nearly repeat itself. A later mission sent another astronaut outside to test a rocket-powered maneuvering backpack, this time wearing extra protective gear to shield against the equipment's hot thrusters. The moment he exited the hatch, that protective gear stiffened into something closer to a suit of rigid armor. Every attempt to move triggered an equal and opposite reaction, sending him spinning. Without adequate cooling, his heart rate climbed past 180 beats per minute, and he began sweating so heavily his visor fogged over completely, leaving him nearly blind and forced to navigate his way back to the hatch by feel alone. Getting him back inside required the commander to physically wrestle him into his seat before they could force the hatch closed. He'd lost nearly 13 pounds of water weight in under 2 hours. These two brutal experiences forced real change. NASA began training astronauts underwater in massive tanks where buoyancy could simulate the weightlessness of space over long, realistic sessions, rather than 30-second bursts on an aircraft. Engineers also abandoned gas-based cooling entirely, replacing it with a water-cooled undergarment that could keep an astronaut comfortable for hours rather than minutes, a system that would later let Apollo astronauts work on the lunar surface for the better part of a day without overheating. The lesson had cost 2 crews their composure, their fluids, and nearly their safety. But it's the reason the moonwalks worked as smoothly as they did. A trip to the moon wouldn't take 15 minutes, or even a single day. It would take well over a week. And before this stretch of missions, nobody actually knew whether a spacecraft's power systems or the human body itself could hold up that long. Start with the power problem. Earlier missions had relied on a type of battery offering the best energy density available at the time. But batteries alone simply couldn't scale. Powering a spacecraft for 2 full weeks using battery cells alone would have added so much weight that the mission would have needed a far larger rocket, one that didn't yet exist. It wasn't a matter of engineering difficulty. It was a hard physical wall. The solution was a completely different kind of power source, a device that combined liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen across a membrane, generating electricity through a chemical reaction rather than storing it chemically like a battery. The byproduct of that reaction happened to be pure water, meaning the same system solved 2 problems at once, generating both power and drinking water for the crew. It didn't work perfectly on its first real test. Early in one mission, a heater failure caused pressure to drop and threatened to knock out power entirely. The crew shut down every non-essential system on board and scrapped their planned exercises, eventually stabilizing at bare minimum power for a quiet, drifting flight. 2 astronauts spent the better part of 8 days conserving energy in a cold, dim capsule, an experience that, years later, would directly inform how NASA managed to save a crew during a real power crisis on the way to the moon. Power wasn't the only unknown. A separate mission asked 2 astronauts to spend 14 straight days inside a cabin roughly the size of the front seat of a small car. Scientists feared weightlessness might cause the human skeleton to break down entirely, leaving bones dangerously brittle by the time of re-entry. They were partly right. Without gravity's constant load, the astronauts' bodies did begin shedding calcium at an alarming rate, though fortunately not enough to cause a fracture during landing. The finding was serious enough to reshape spaceflight going forward, leading directly to onboard exercise routines and resistance training built into every future mission's daily schedule. Living conditions mattered too, in ways nobody had fully appreciated. 2 weeks in a cramped, unwashed capsule meant overwhelming odor, limited food, and mounting physical discomfort, enough that the crew eventually pushed back against wearing bulky pressure suits for the entire flight, winning the right to remove them for comfort during quieter stretches. It sounds like a minor victory. It wasn't. It proved that basic crew comfort wasn't a luxury. It was a genuine safety requirement, one that shaped how future crews dressed for the vast majority of their journey. Surviving the trip and reaching orbit meant nothing if a crew couldn't come home again. And coming home safely required something no earlier mission had ever managed, actually steering a spacecraft through the atmosphere, rather than simply falling and hoping. Earlier capsules had been almost entirely passive during descent, at the mercy of their trajectory once re-entry began. This generation introduced something new, an onboard digital computer paired with a system for tracking the vehicle's exact orientation, giving astronauts the ability to actively influence their own descent. By rolling the capsule to shift how it interacted with the atmosphere, a technique known as lifting re-entry, a crew could steer toward a specific landing point instead of simply hoping physics cooperated. The theory needed real-world correction almost immediately. One of the earliest attempts missed its intended landing zone by well over 60 miles, forcing engineers to accept that their models had underestimated how much lift the capsule actually generated in the atmosphere. They rebuilt those aerodynamic calculations from the ground up. The improvement showed almost immediately, By the program's final mission, a crew flew an entirely automatic, computer-guided re-entry and splashed down barely 3 miles from their recovery ship, a level of precision that would have sounded impossible just a few years earlier. That precision wasn't a nice bonus, it was non-negotiable for anything traveling to the moon and back. Without the navigation math and steering techniques proven here, there was no way to guarantee a safe return from lunar distance, let alone a reliable pickup point somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The groundwork. Beneath the footprint. 10 missions. 16 astronauts. 20 months. That's a strikingly short window to solve rocket vibrations, violent enough to knock a person unconscious, master the strange backward logic of orbital rendezvous, survive a spin that nearly killed 2 astronauts mid-flight, learn the hard way what the human body can and can't endure outside a spacecraft, and figure out how to fall back to Earth with pinpoint accuracy instead of blind luck. And yet, that's exactly what happened. History remembers the giant leap. It rarely remembers the program that made the leap survivable, the one that quietly answered every question standing between a man in orbit for 15 minutes and a man walking on another world. Where the earliest missions proved humans could simply exist in space, this program proved they could work there, live there, and come home from there reliably. And the lessons didn't end when the program did. The same orbital mechanics, the same power systems, the same hard-earned understanding of what the human body needs to survive long-duration spaceflight, all of it is still in active use today, as a new generation works to return to the lunar surface and eventually push further toward Mars. The footprint gets the glory, but underneath it, there's always a bridge someone had to build first. That's the story of the program history forgot to remember, brought to you by Nebulix.